Thanks for coming to this. So, one of the very first questions that comes to me is, well, what makes me qualified to do this? I taught communication for about 20 years in the healthcare setting, and it was based on my master's thesis, and it was about a new theory I wrote about how to actually measure communication and evaluate satisfaction with communication. It got me hired right out of my degree program into healthcare, where, like I said, I spent almost 20 years doing evaluations. That included focus groups and interventions, consulting, all sorts of other things. And I'm finding that as I move into the library setting, most of it translates actually very, very easily and very well. That doesn't really, well, that's interesting. Do I have control? There we go. Everything's a little bit delayed. So the big question is, why? Why should librarians in particular think about this? I could easily justify why doctors should, but why should librarians think about all this? Well, at least in the beginning, it's a core component of your job. I just finished up my MSLIS, and almost every single class I took in the program at Drexel said communication. Communication is vital. Communication is important, but they never actually talked about what communication was. So you were left a little bit high and dry in terms of figuring out what that meant. Your ability to understand communication clearly influences your success or your likelihood of success significantly. I'm not trying to suggest that knowing more about communication is going to somehow magically turn you into some sort of charismatic speaker or a TED Talk must watch, that you're going to be this fantastic speaker. I'm only saying understanding more about the processes that occur when people are involved in some sort of interaction is of great benefit all the time. You should also want to know more about communication, because even though it introduces more moving parts into your interaction, it helps resolve issues. So I know from listening to the director calls very clearly, most of you have way more on your plate than you can really manage on a daily basis, or you have more than enough or just enough. If you follow through the communication processes and you have ways to analyze these interactions very effectively and efficiently, it can actually reduce the amount of work on your plate. So, this works through HR issues, patron issues, vendor discussions, budget presentations. Just almost every single interaction you have can be sort of reduced formulaically, but it's also not easy. So I understand that part. Ultimately, communication is about building relationships, and communication science is a way of acknowledging that most of the time we have this extremely limited amount of time to establish meaning in those initial communications. Many of you may have read Blink, and by Gladwell, Gladwell says that you get this blink impression of people, and that's what starts out how your relationship builds and how it works. Communication works there too. I mean, you get basically that first interaction, what you say, what you do. Those things are all very true. There's some fantastic research down at the University of Georgia about that, where they've scientifically validated what Gladwell said. You really do have that blink impression. It's a very, very strong impression. When you're working with communication, you actually have ways to modify that first impression and change the way that works. It's important to know that when you're evaluating communication, you have to approach it as a participant. You're not walking into it with any particular hat on your head. So, if you walk into an interaction with a predetermined role, you're going to influence the interaction for a bunch of reasons we're going to talk about later on. It's not always a bad thing, but it's not always a good thing either. So I'm not asking you to not be a director. You're the director of the library. That carries with it obligations and responsibilities. But I am saying that if you walk into every interaction with much more of a tabula rasa, a blank slate approach, it'll help you understand and analyze what's actually happening in the interaction. Hopefully this gets a little more clear. One more, I want to stress this again. This stuff is really hard. It gets easier, but it is really hard. It's not like we're going to have this brief 45-minute, 30-minute, whatever discussion about this, and you're all going to be experts. I studied formally for 2 years. I did 2 years of research, kind of 24/7 research, human subjects research with people on one particular kind of interaction in one specific setting. I still learn new things all the time. And it's not just about it not being doctor-patient versus other things, because this is mostly generalizable. That's why part of it is so hard. Communication can be a moving target. And if you settle into a pattern, so let's start out with a really, really simple question. When we're talking about communication here, what is communication, right? So I have a little prompt. This was actually supposed to be the first video, Edna Mode, from The Incredibles. And if you've ever seen The Incredibles, at one point, Elastigirl is talking to her about Mr. Incredible disappearing. And Edna's response is, his words are useless. Gabba, gabba, gabba. It's too much of it, darling. It's too much, right? But thinking back to more realism, how many times in the past 2 weeks have we heard someone say, words matter? How many times after the Capitol insurrection have we heard words matter? And they use those words to assign blame, cause, effect, everything. So, not to minimize what Ed is saying, do words matter or don't words matter? And how does this apply to communication? What does it really mean when we're trying to define communication? So, here's some basic questions. Does communication have to have a purpose or intent? Does there have to be more than one participant? So what I'm thinking about here is if I'm walking down the street and I'm having a conversation with God, am I communicating? If I'm talking to myself, am I communicating? What about meaning or meaningfulness? These are strange concepts or different things to think about. Does there have to be meaning? So if I say, how many marshmallows does it take to get to the moon? Purple, because ice cream doesn't have bones. Does that constitute communication? And who do these statements apply to? Do they apply to everyone in the interaction? Is it just the person who's talking has to have intent? Does the person who's talking have to have meaning in what they're saying? Or does everybody involved in the interaction have to have meaning and intent and purpose? And does there have to be more than one in this? So obviously, if you're talking to yourself, that doesn't work if you're talking to God. How do we divine these things? How do we figure out? So, back to what I'd said before about building relationships and communication. If a patron or a trustee, a board member, an employee drops some issue on your lap, you often don't have very much time to establish meaning, right? They walk in and they spit out what's going on. The other way to look at that is, the simple way to describe that is, there are the words you say, there are the meaning of those words, and there are the words they hear. Turn that around. There are the words they say, there are the meaning of those words, and they're the words you hear, right? So if you start looking at purpose, more than one participant, meaning, who does that actually apply to? Those are really the things you're thinking about. The words you say, what you actually meant when you said that, and what did the other person hear on the other side? Relationships are longitudinal, right? Communication may be longitudinal. You may have regular conversations, but the interaction, for every interaction, it happens just in that moment and in the next moment and in the response to that moment and the reaction to your response. It's not like a regular relationship where you may take, years or weeks or months or whatever, days to suss out what the meaning is in this relationship. Somebody says something, you have to understand very quickly how to get to the meaning of that statement. It's not always easy to understand this. It's not easy to get it right, but it does get easier over time. The more time you spend with these people, the more longitudinal. Remember, we're not wearing a hat, so we're just listening to what they're saying. We're not assigning meaning or intent based on what we know. We're assigning it based on that particular moment. So let's go back to defining communication. I don't know if there are questions or comments that are coming up, but we have to have a definition of communication. One of the reasons we have to have a definition of communication is we're talking about communication science. So the hallmark of science, what do we say science is, right? Has to be measurable, has to be repeatable. If everything is communication, how do we measure everything? How do we determine success? How do we determine failure? So we have to be able to define communication in such a way that we can measure it, that we can potentially repeat it. So a scientific definition of communication is it is the intentional exchange of mutually meaningful symbols, okay? Everyone knows what intent is. People bring intent into their interactions. They bring intent into their words. They bring intent into their lives. One of the difficulties in establishing communication is discerning mutual meaningfulness, right? So that's something we're going to get into later, and it is one of the more difficult pieces of this. But symbols, when we talk about symbols, we're talking about words, utterances, gestures, glances, postures, size, anything else. It's important to remember silence or inaction is as much a symbol as gesticulating and waving your hands around or yelling or shouting. Silence actually counts as a piece of it. There are actually entire courses taught on the meaning of silence. If you have any element of this missing, if it's not intentional, if it's not an exchange, if it's just one person dictating, this seminar, by its very nature, because it's one way, this actually doesn't qualify as communication. Okay, so there's no exchange right at this particular minute. This is just me speaking and lecturing or whatever. If there's not mutual meaning and if there are no symbols involved in it, so a piece of paper on a desk, that's not really, it's maybe a communication, but it is not, doesn't actually create communication. So it's important to remember though, when we say something is or isn't communication, we are not implying failure in terms of a judgment. When we're evaluating communication, it's is communication or it isn't communication. It has very little to do with judging your ability or the other person's ability or anything else. There's nothing to do with it. This is like Planet Fitness. This is a no judgment zone. Okay, you're only evaluating the communication to try to get to the meaning or the mutual meaningfulness that you can establish between the two of you. I said X, you think I said Y, there's no communication going on. Why does that matter? Well, again, we go back to science. How do you measure it? How do you repeat it? How do you test it? How can you test anything if you don't have this baseline definition of communication? So we're starting out with a baseline definition. We have elements. We can certainly measure intent. We can measure whether or not there's an exchange. We can absolutely measure meaningfulness. That's the theory I wrote in grad school, is how to measure that. And we can certainly see what the symbols are over time. If it sounds a little bit like this is a rule, it's because it is. Communication is entirely rules governed. So that means if A, then B. And that actually maps out very clearly and very easily, depending on which school of thought you go to. But for what I'm talking about here, you can almost always follow the rules of communication to get from point A to point B. Like I said, the mutual meaningfulness part is probably the most important, but we're going to have to get to that part a little bit later. We're not going to talk about a ton of rules. There are tons and tons of different rules that apply to that, but we are going to talk about some of the most important ones and some of the more important components of what communication is. Understanding these rules let you actually map out and anticipate. So you come into the interaction as a blank slate, but as the interaction starts to occur, you can start mapping out, okay, this is where it's going to go. This is where I need it to go. And you do that by paying attention to what the rules are and what the components of the interaction are. So what other constructs play into communication? So the big three, if you're talking about evaluating communication and being effective at it, are power, expectancy, and worldview. These are the key core components of understanding. Now, power doesn't sound like communication, but you have to acknowledge power influences communication at every single level. We no longer have a president that tweets. There was the day that account was suspended, there was a 70% drop in traffic in conspiracy theories. Now that has to do with centrality measures and social media analytics, but it's no different. It's the exact same thing. Power influences where you are, what you bring in there. Power is, if anyone wants to look at power a little bit more, easiest thing to do is you look up French and Raven. Seminal definition is back from 1959. It's a great thing to look at, but I think we all sort of inherently understand that power, what power is: legitimate, reward, expert, referent, coercive, informational. If you want to know more about those things, but for now, the basic concept is power has influence on communication, how it starts, how it moves forward, and how it works. Expectancy is a little bit different. So expectancy theory is something that came out of the University of Arizona. A guy and his wife, Michael and Judy Burgoon, both sort of on different sides of it. Expectancy theory says that an individual will behave or act in a certain way because they're motivated to select a specific behavior over others because they expect a certain result out of that selected behavior. Bullies bully because they expect you to cower and do what they say. Cajoling, payment, begging forgiveness. You select your behavior based on what you want or expect the response that will be, and those responses are generally based in societal norms. So communication is based in psychology and sociology, all sorts of things that influence our entire worldview, which is the next piece of this. So what we have been taught over the courses of our lives to expect from certain behaviors, that's how we introduce our communication efforts because we have intent, right? We want to shape our intent. Expectancy violations is another piece. Expectancy violations is just the opposite of expectancy. So it's how you respond to unanticipated violations of social norms. For instance, when I said that thing about how many marshmallows does it take to go to the moon, purple because ice cream doesn't have bones, I'm purposefully trying to violate your expectations of what you're going to hear out of this. That's one take on that. Expectancy violations, holding an interview with somebody, a formal interview, and taking it down a side path into any specific interest you find that person has that's outside of the interview's purview. It's legal. You can certainly do it. You can't judge it. But having those side conversations violate the expectancy of the actual interview. And you let them lead that. I mean, it's similar to how you let focus grouping work. Worldview is simply each person's cognitive orientation. It incorporates their education from kindergarten all the way up through to wherever they are now, whether it's high school, college, advanced graduate work, whatever. It's their political viewpoints. It's their feelings towards society. It's all of that all rolled up. And there are often very clear signs and signals of what they are. People self-identify. They're QAnon people. They're liberals. They're feminists. There's a million labels out there. Labels are by and large useless when it comes to communication, but they're incredibly useful when it comes to understanding a person's meaning. They're a veteran. They're a race car driver. They're an old man, if that's how they self-identify. So an example of power, expectancy, and worldview all rolled up into one quick example. At one of my seminars where I was teaching this, I had a doctor raise his hand, and the doctor says, I got a question for you. Okay. He says, I had a patient the other day, and they brought him into the room, and he was there for something pretty simple. This is in an emergency department. And, I went in and I said, hi, my name's Dr. Smith. And the guy looks at me and he goes, hey, John, how are you? And he shook my hand. And then he told me what his problem was. And I said, it's Dr. Smith. And the guy said, yeah, okay, John, but I'm curious, how do we do this? And the doctor was livid because he's a doctor, right? He's got a title. He knows who he is. His worldview is that he was raised. And I would agree that he deserves the respect of being called a doctor. The patient was a stockbroker who had just made a huge killing in the market. He made like a couple of $1 million, something like that. And he was extremely excited and very full of himself. So that's all the roundabout side of understanding, what actually went on in there. And it's all pretty well resolved by asking the doctor, I understand you're really upset, and I agree, you probably deserve more respect, but that really has nothing to do with what's your job. So, his job is to take care of patients, right? I don't remember reading anything in any description of being a physician that says you're supposed to get into an ego contest with your patients. So why is he making that patient's demand to be recognized as an equal his problem? He still holds all the power in that interaction because he's the doctor ultimately who's going to treat that patient and does the prescribing and does all the work. So all of those other things, all the tension should disappear because the patient can say whatever he wants to. The doctor's still in charge. You're a director, you have a problem patron, that patron can say whatever they want to. You're still the director of the library. You're still the one who makes the rules, and you're still the one who's in charge. If that person needs to vent or needs to be able to say that, that's all fine. But ultimately, you're still going to have to communicate with them in a way that penetrates through that fog of illusion of control. And you need to find out how to create meaningfulness with that patron, because you can't just kick every patron out. There's a problem. So hopefully that example made some sense for you. So, how do you examine or evaluate an interaction? Well, I mean, you start at the beginning and you watch the follow through, which is actually fairly easy, because in order to do this, we're going to look at a couple of different rules. So, the beginning of any interaction starts with setting rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement are called constitutive rules. So here's your first technical term. Constitutive rules determine how meaning is assigned to a speech act. Your other technical terms are speech acts or utterances. So constitutive rules are how you initiate an interaction. So if I start out something by saying, hey, how about those Yankees? There's one thing. It's very different than walking into an office and saying, we need to sit down and talk about your performance now. You're setting down the rules of engagement. You're setting down the constitutive rule that says, hey, I'm here on a social event. Hey, I'm here as your boss. Two very different things. And you should recognize that as the person in power, when you say those things, that's exactly how your staff see them. You're the person in power. So as the person in power, the obligation almost always falls to you to set those rules of engagement, even if you're responding via what's called the regulative rule. Staff member comes up to you and they make a statement to you. You respond in what's called a regulatory response, a regulative rule. So the regulative rule either supports what they said or it tries to countermand what they've said. How about them Yankees? Yeah, so we had this problem here in the library today where this book was cataloged improperly. Okay, they're changing the regulative rule. We need to talk about your performance over the past 2 weeks. Well, you never talked to me about this before, and you've never said anything to me. Again, the regulative rule is that they're now trying to change the conversation. Or we need to discuss your performance over the next 2 weeks. The appropriate regulative response is, yeah, I agree. That's probably a good idea. I've had some concerns. Thank you for bringing this up, and let's talk about this. So do people understand how this works? There's a really good example of this, and hopefully no one gets upset because it goes back to about the 70s and it adopts those sort of cultural norms. There is a game called The Dozens, and it's used as an example in almost all the communication programs I know. But constitutive and regulative rules are demonstrated perfectly in the game of The Dozens. It is defined as, it's a pattern of interactive insults. It's evident among all classes of African Americans, males and females, children and adults. Two participants engage in banter, always in front of others. They instigate the participants to continue the game by making insults worse. So for those of you who haven't figured it out, this is the Yo Mama game. So big thing in New York, especially in the Bronx, it is, unfortunately, I was wrong. I thought that's where it originated. It didn't. There are a ton of sources of what the origination was that go back to actually slave times and come up through alternate versions in New Orleans. It's actually kind of a fascinating thing to look at. But it's a pattern of insults. And the idea is that one person insults the other person's mother. The other person's obligation regulatively is to respond with an insult that's worse. So you would start out with, your mama's so stupid, it takes her an hour to cook minute rice. Okay? Yeah, that's not so bad. Your mama's so poor, I saw her kicking a can down the street. I asked her what she was doing. She said, moving. It escalates from there, but it's a game, and the participants know it's a game. So we have context now. So we know regulatively and constitutively, we know that this is a game and they're going to exchange insults. Let's take it outside of there. I walk up to somebody in Home Depot and I pull one of those Yo Mama jokes out. Constitutively, have I started a game or have I started a fight? Right? Context matters. So you have to remember that when you are in whatever position you're in, whatever you're trying to do, whether it's addressing the select board or addressing an employee, you have a context, you have power in some level, at some level or some other level. It's hard to know if you're the boss versus going to the select board or your trustees. There are different levels. You have to figure out where that balance is and how you're gonna regulatively respond or how you're going to initiate that. You can initiate it with a fight. We've presented to the select board numerous times in the past, and these things have not been addressed. We'd like to know when we're going to be able to move forward. I'd like to remind the select board that they really have no say in our budget. And I've read these sorts of statements. Those are all sort of picking fights, and you've done that yourself. It's not very beneficial. You may feel like you have to do that, but it's not very beneficial. So, and remember how I talked about expectancy violations, right? So you see how those things can fit in there? You walk in through Home Depot, you see somebody you know, they don't expect you to insult their mother, right? They expect you to talk about what you're doing there, what you're doing, what your project is, what you're working on. You're walking through the Bronx and you happen to be African American and you've engaged in these kinds of games before, and you see a friend of yours and there are other people around and you can get things going. Okay, then you can start that and it's going because you've initiated a game. But it's really all about what is that initiating comment and what is that regulative response to that. The dozens is just a really nice example of this is a game, other things, this is not a game.
So Adam, probably a good time to see if anybody has questions. I don't have anything in the chat, but if anyone has a question so far, you can feel free to unmute. We'll give a couple of seconds of silence for that to happen. And I just ask, like we do on the director's calls, you say your name and the library you're from as you ask your question.
I mean, these are a lot of really new, weird concepts, and I get that, but I can prove that all of this stuff exists and happens in the background in every single interaction you have.
Yeah, and I know you have some great examples to share with us that will sort of bring some of these higher level concepts home to what we do as directors every day. Right. So I think, since I'm not seeing anybody unmute, go for it and let's continue.
All right. So, what does it mean to a librarian's relationship with their audience? Well, who's your audience? Are you talking to your patrons? Are you talking to your boards, your trustees? Are you talking to your select boards, vendors, negotiating with vendors? Meaning is established within the context. It's a little bit self-evident, but it's sometimes we don't think about that because we're so busy over the course of the day. The context is also defined by the rules that you're engaged in. Again, remembering power, expectancy, worldview, So if I'm talking to a vendor, their job is to sell me stuff, right? My job is that I need to purchase stuff, but I need to make sure I'm a good steward of the tax dollars of the town. So, how does that work? So here's an example. The other day, I was about 2 months ago, I was buying something. Number one, I know it's the end of the year, and I know vendors have quotas that they're supposed to meet by the end of the year. So I figure I'm in a decent position, so I'll be nice about it, and I'm not going to get contentious with the vendor. The vendor I send an email out, the vendor sends me back a quote. And I do a little research, and I say, gee, can we have a quick conversation? And we talk. But we spend at least half of that conversation not talking about what I'm buying. And she agrees to do a revised quote based on our needs being somewhat reduced after our conversation. She sends me back the quote, but magically somehow the quote is not only reduced by the amount of materials I don't need, but it's reduced by 5%. I didn't ask her for a 5% discount, but she's starting to identify me as a person, not as a customer. So I said, gee, we got some other things that we don't need anymore. Can we just connect real quick? So she calls me, we connect a little bit more. She reduces the quote even more. We're now at, I think I ended up at 45% of the original quote. And somehow magically I got another 5% added onto the discount, only because we now have a relationship that is not vendor to director. We have a relationship. And I did this for years when I was working. I always established a relationship with my vendors, especially if I knew I was going to be buying from them over and over and over and over again. The select board here, we did drive-ins and we got lucky, but we had some of our select board volunteer to help us set up the drive-in screen and come. And I spent a good amount of time talking to them, but not as the director. I talked to them as a guy who was here to watch the movie, and they all knew who I was. But as a result, we have a very strong relationship with our select board, I'm told, for the first time in 5, 6, 7 years. And it's manifested in terms of a unanimous approval at every level of our budget for the first time in I'm told 5 to 7 years. No questions, no nothing. Just thank you for putting this budget forward. It looks very responsible, and we think you're doing a great job, and we'd like to commend you. I built a relationship with them before I ever brought the budget forward. It isn't always easy. Sometimes you're swallowing things. We have a lot of Trump supporters here. That's totally irrelevant to what you're trying to do. That could sound Machiavellian, and it probably is on some level, but you're trying to build relationships, and your relationships are based on the results you want to get. Expectancy, right? What are you trying to do here? What do you expect out of that? You adopt the communication strategies that are necessary, the messaging strategies that are necessary to get you to your end point. Sometimes that means making friends with people you might not otherwise do. That was my specialty as a consultant with doctors. I found something to like about every one of them genuinely, because people know when you're not genuine about these things. So you just have to accommodate for major variances in perspective and worldview. So there's a case study. If anyone wants to actually watch the video, go to YouTube and Google Kansas State University reference interview. It's pretty clear. So in the first part of this, a woman walks into a large academic center, approaches the reference desk. Reference librarian never looks up. And she finally says, "Excuse me." And the guy looks at her and says, "Yeah, what do you want?" And she says, I was just wondering, can birds fly? And reference guy looks at her, cocks his head, and he goes, "Yeah, birds can. Yeah, birds can fly. Why are you asking me this?" Now, those of you who may have just gotten out of school, you may have actually seen this or heard this, so don't say anything. But I want someone to tell me what just happened there. So unmute yourself or put it in the chat or something. Tell me what happened. Because she leaves, of course, because he gave her the answer, right? Birds can fly. So what actually happened in that interaction? Using the tools, so using expectancy, power, what actually just happened there?
Don't
Anybody?
be shy. Somebody.
Come on,
Somebody
cab.
give it a shot.
All right. So that's why it's hard with these things. It's much better when I can.
We got somebody.
All right.
Go ahead. Okay, in the chat, Natalie says the woman felt ignored, judged, and she left.
She did. I mean, she got an answer, right? But did that answer have any meaning? I mean, do we know if it had meaning? Is that what reference librarians do? Look up and say, "What do you want?" We were taught in reference class that reference exchanges are exchanges where you try to figure out what the other person's looking for. So yeah, exactly, Natalie. I mean, that's what happened. There was a violation from the get-go. Number one, the constitutive rule should have been set by the reference librarian saying, "What can I do to help you?" Right? And she should have been able to respond. Instead, the constitutive rule was set by his actions, which were to ignore her. So she regulatively ended up responding with a sort of plea. I was just wondering, can birds fly? And he had no follow-up to that. So regulatively, he just shut her down, right? He continued with his, "I'm in power, I'm in charge." And his expectancy, in this case, what we're looking at is she came looking for an answer. He gave her power instead of an answer and violated the expectations she had. He didn't give her an answer with any meaning to it. And that's where meaning comes in. Now, when you fail at meaning in an exchange, you have dissatisfaction. That's the big link. When meaningfulness fails or meaning fails in an interaction, you get no satisfaction out of it. Somebody has an unhappy experience. So being able to define that and evaluate that was what my whole thesis was about. But that's the upshot, is that lack of meaning in an interaction more than anything else yields non-satisfaction. So if you think about that with your patrons, think about that with your trustees or with the board of selectmen, that's what you're aiming for. You're not aiming for kudos, you're not aiming for anything, you're aiming for satisfaction out of the interaction. So that's really what happened in that interaction. So the next case study, what happens is the woman walks in And the reference librarian immediately looks up and says, "Can I help you?" And she says, "So I was just wondering, it's an odd question, but can birds fly?" And the reference librarian looks up in response and says, "Well, I'm not sure I understand. Are you asking if birds are capable of flight?" And she says, "Oh, no, I'm going to see my aunt in Milwaukee, and I'd really like to take my parrot along with me on the plane. So I'm wondering, can birds fly?" And the reference librarian says, "Oh, do you know what airline you're on? And let me look up and see what their pet policy is." So now you can actually see how incredibly wrong the first scenario was, because you see a good case of establishing meaningfulness. One simple question. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Can you help me understand? Are you asking this?" And she immediately clarifies. So you've got that constitutive rule of, "I'm here to help you." She regulates it with, "Here's the question I need help with." And he responds regulatively with, "Okay, I can help, but I need to know a little bit more." And she gives him that additional information. So you have this nice, easy flow of, "Here's the problem. Here's what I'm trying to figure out. Okay, how can I help you with that?" And it flows through, and you can see where meaning is established there. It's a very great example of, and it's really not, I mean, it's in a reference interview setting. And if you want to watch it, it's interesting. They use the same reference librarian for both of them. And I don't really believe that any reference librarian would be as offhand as he is in the first one. I mean, he's rolling his eyes, he's looking at the camera. But that's an example of how these things flow, okay? And that's an example from inside. So, ultimately in the first case, was it communication? No, you had no meaning. And you have decreased satisfaction, which we'll probably get back to the library. Was the second one communication? Absolutely. Intent is there, purpose is there. It was two-way. There was more than one participant. It wasn't really more than one participant in the first one. And there was meaning. Beautiful. Now you've got the textbook definition of communication. And because you have communication, you have satisfaction with the exchange.
Adam, we've got two comments in the chat I just want to mention. And the first one is, they say how entering every situation, how the energy and empathy we put into the assumptions we make in our interactions. Empathy is often seen as a positive quality, but it seems it can create unnecessary stress or miscommunication if we do not start with an open mind about what and why is being said, especially when communicating with unhappy staff and patrons. So how do we go into each conversation as a blank slate?
That's a great question. So it takes practice. I'm not trying to make light of it. So we had, we're going to eat a little bit of time here, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyways. We had a director's call, where one of the directors was speaking about an employee who was, I think I would use the term brittle and bossy. So she had lots of issues all the time. She tried to take charge. She didn't so much try to have discussions with the director, if I read that properly or heard that properly. She came in essentially with demands, and the director was having difficulty figuring out what to do in that circumstance. So, how do you empathize in that circumstance? So there's a couple of things to take away. The first thing, and probably most important thing to remember, is it's not always possible to communicate effectively with some people. There are some people you simply need to walk away from, and that needs to be established early on. But if you haven't established it early on, you need to set that expectation moving forward. And again, it's about expectancy and expectancy violations. So in that case, are you going to empathize with somebody who's complaining and upset about potentially the wrong things all the time? Well, no. But you are, in that case, going to step in as the director. And you're going to say, I understand what you're saying, and I clearly hear your concerns. You've made them quite understandable to me because you've presented them numerous times. But here's the thing. I'm the director, and I have to answer to my trustees. My trustees are saying that they agree with what the direction I've chosen here. If this is something that's simply not acceptable to you, that's a different conversation that we need to have. But we can't continue to have this back and forth, because clearly you're not happy with the direction we're taking. And this is the direction the library has to move in, because ultimately We aren't here for the trustees or me or you. We're here for the community. The trustees believe we are moving in the direction the community is putting forward to us. I have vetted that position. I believe that position is safe and effective and that we can do this properly. If that's not something you believe, then we need to talk about what sort of accommodations we need to make and terminate the conversation at that point. Tell them to think about that and move back. Sometimes communication consists of being in charge. Sometimes communication consists of being empathetic. Generally, when I walk in, I start out with large amounts of empathy. If a case comes up that challenges that or tells me that it's a failed strategy because there's not shared meaning, then I'll jump on that. So in my own place here, we were having staff meetings based on my asking the staff how frequently they wanted to have them through COVID and how we wanted to work through. We had them, we decreased the frequency over time as folks got more comfortable. We had one meeting set up, the time was set, everybody was upstairs waiting. The assistant director went over, yelled down the stairs and said, hey, we're all here ready, waiting for the meeting. And the person downstairs said, my clock says I have 5 more minutes. We waited another minute. I went over and I said, we're waiting for you. The meeting needs to start. And the person said, my clock says we have 3 more minutes. So I went back and we all sat and we waited. And the person came upstairs and we started the meeting. After the meeting, she went back downstairs and I followed her back downstairs and I said, just so you understand, that was without a doubt the most disrespectful display I have ever seen. I'm not interested in that. So please understand, I'm speaking as the director right now. That is not acceptable behavior. She completely understood what I said. Didn't so much apologize, but her behavior changed radically from that day forward. Her behavior previously to that was that she tolerated all the rest of us as employees and tolerated me as the director. She doesn't. She has value for us, and she recognizes that there's value in demonstrating that. So I hope I'm answering your question. You use the tools that are available to you to use, but every interaction is its own interaction. Empathy is absolutely the right way to go sometimes. Sometimes you are the director and you challenge.
That's great, Adam. And let me give you another example that came through in chat. Rebecca put in there that she just had someone ask her not even 5 minutes ago if she had a chair. She's at the library, she's working. And she asked him if he meant to borrow or to have or to sit in the library. He wanted one to take home. And she explained that the chairs are city property, but asked if he had tried Goodwill or Salvation Army. He said they're rude to him. So she got him the name and number of a local used furniture store that he could try so that he could buy a chair.
Yep.
So
beautiful.
It's a simple, I think that was a great example. And thank you, Rebecca, for sharing that of approaching the situation more like a blank slate.
Yep. So throw another example out from here. We have a patron who is a diagnosed schizophrenic. He has been a problem occasionally. He shows up for events and he's sometimes very disruptive. He's often disruptive up front. He feels that the library doesn't take him seriously. He feels that the library looks down at him. When I started here, I just introduced myself to him and told him that he needed to put on a mask or leave. He put it on right away and did what he needed to do, and then he left. And then he started calling me once a week to let me know his perspective on things. And I propped the phone up against my ear and semi-listen and mostly work while he's talking. As a result, he now feels like he has a voice in the library. Does it cost me? Yeah, I mean, it cost me 20 minutes once a week, but now my staff are never bothered or harassed by him again. And he's a member of the community, so he has a right to come in and use the library. If I can modify his behavior in a certain way, just by being available to him, I'm going to do that. Does that sometimes lead to conflict? Yes. I mean, he had a conversation 2 weeks ago where he was telling me that the lizard people were taking over. I swear I'm not making this up. The lizard people were taking over, the Greys, whoever they are, were taking over, Trump was going to take his rightful place as ruler of the world, lots of stuff like that. And I said, okay, so here's the scoop. We're done. We're done here. You're welcome to come in and use the library, but these conversations are now over. And I hung up. And he didn't come in for 2 weeks. He didn't call for 2 weeks, but he has started coming back, and he's still very respectful. And he's very nice. He really wants to establish communication with me. He has told my front end people that I'm a really good dude. So even though I'm not talking to him anymore, I'm still a really cool dude. But we've changed the nature of that relationship just by giving him a voice. Not everybody has that kind of time. I get that, nor hopefully, my God, I hope you don't have patrons like that. But there are ways to always engage with this. And there are ways to always shift behavior. Again, yeah, maybe it's a little Machiavellian, but ultimately what I'm doing is I hope for the good of the community and for the good of the patrons and the other patrons. Other things to think about as we talk about these case studies too, I just want to just make a quick note. You always have to think about other little things, all the nonverbal things that exist and non-communication things. The desk the librarian is sitting behind, that's a barrier. So you need to understand, just like crossing your arms, that's a barrier. These things create barriers. Turning away and crossing your legs, that's a barrier. So these nonverbal behaviors create barriers to effective communication and empathy and understanding and meaning. Seated versus standing in your discussions. When you walk in and you're looking down at somebody, you think that would give you power over them, but really the person who's sitting behind the desk ends up retaining the power from a proxemic standpoint. Gender has a huge impact on things. Age, you can't diminish any of these things. They can all be worked with, but they all have a huge impact. Culture, color, everything has an effect. So don't forget all of these things are playing in. They're all at play in the background. Size, whether somebody's a big, huge person, whether they're small, what they bring into the interaction can have a major, major effect. Yeah.
Adam, I have a question related to that that was seconded in the chat. What role does sex or gender play, if any, in communication? And can you talk more about that?
So
and I think this the question may relate back to the example you just gave with the schizophrenic patron, and how and maybe this will help to hone it a little bit. You're male, you dealt with the situation. How might it be different if it was a female director, given what you know about this patron, this individual?
So ultimately, if you become adept at communication, it makes no difference at all. But initially, absolutely makes a difference. So let me give you an example. I'm going to have to dip back into healthcare because I don't have any, but out of library work. But so an example, patient presents in the emergency department. I did a lot of work in emergency departments with her husband. After 2.5, 3 hours, the patient feels ignored, upset, frustrated. The husband is absolutely gone in terms of anger. He demands to speak to a patient advocate. So gets his wife back out to his truck. They get the patient advocate all set up. They bring the guy up to the advocacy room, which is just a very small little interview room. And he walks in. The patient advocate is 4'11", small, diminutive woman. And the first thing he says when he walks in is he gestures to the security guard and he says, "What the hell is he doing here?" And she looks at him and she says, "Well, he's here for our security. It's part of the hospital protocol. He has to be here." He's like, I don't, what the hell? What are you saying? I'm dangerous? She says, no, it's just the hospital protocol. He has to be here. Well, things just keep escalating from there. The concerns are never addressed. And he storms out, which of course leads to a letter from an attorney 2 to 3 months later. I'm sure you can come up with situations that are somewhat similar in a library, maybe not quite as immediate in terms of intensity. But there's an example of this. So what happened there? What plays into this? Okay, number one, the first question should be, who's the guy? Well, the guy is an old Mainer. He's been around and living in Maine his whole life. He's a huge guy. He's about 6'4", and he's a farmer. And he's been out in the fields working all day. And you can tell he's been working all day because you can smell it a mile away, right? So he's old, he's tired, he's big, He's a main guy. He's an independent main guy. What's going on? She is very small. She's very soft-spoken. The security guard is also a very large man. So when you start breaking down what happened here, those are the things that should be going on in the back of your mind when you're evaluating. In terms of what happened here, what did that guy want? He wanted answers. He wanted to talk to someone in charge, and he wanted answers. What happened when he walked into the room? The patient advocate immediately deferred to hospital policy and the security guard having to be there. So he never got any power. He never got to speak to power. He never got to speak to anyone really that in his mind made anything happen. So there's how gender plays into a circumstance like that. How could she have changed it? Because we did a lot of work with this particular circumstance. What happens if he walks into the room, he looks at her and he says, what the hell is he doing here? And her response, instead of, oh, well, he has to be here, it's the hospital. Instead of that, what he gets is, you worry about him. He's my problem. Forget about him. He doesn't matter. This is about you and me and the experience you had down in the emergency department. And I'm here for you. I'm not here for him. Forget about him. Okay? Just don't worry about it. She's now presenting power. She's giving him, who knows if it would have worked. I know that in subsequent interactions, these sorts of interactions are not exactly rare in most hospitals. Subsequent interactions, that worked because she was giving him what he was looking for. She wasn't challenging him. She was challenging his challenge. So constitutively, he walked in, he challenged the situation, and she responded with a challenge back saying, yeah, I see he's here. I don't care. He's useless. He's just off in the corner and, that's whatever. I don't care about him. He's here because I got no other choice. But I wouldn't have him. She dismisses of him. She's dismissive of the security guard, and she brings the focus back to her and the patient and needing to hear what the problem is. So does that respond? I mean, does that example tell you what you were, that's a very thing. You can look at things like Deborah Tannen, if you want to look at gender communications. Tannen focuses heavily on the sociological aspect of these things. She's not wrong about anything, but she's more about the larger sociological impact of gender on communications. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about individual interactions and the implications of those interactions, many of which are in the immediacy of the situation, fraught with conflict. And you're trying to disarm that conflict by standing up to that conflict. So, you never want to put yourself in a situation where you're at risk. So don't do that. But most men inherently understand power, so don't most women. Does it throw men often when women are powerful? I've worked out of my last 5 bosses, I'd say 4 of them were women. I would never question any of them. Number one, they were extraordinarily talented at what they did. They were fantastic bosses. But I understood that their power came from their knowledge and their expertise. So when they told me, I did. You don't get that with some of your patrons. I mean, you have to look at what is your community. Is your community Republican, Trumpian, Libertarian? What are they bringing into the politics? Because those actually say a lot. There's a lot of studies that have just come out about especially males who buy into Trump, buy into a male-dominated society kind of model. Okay, well, how are you going to make that work? Because they don't think you should have the power. Okay, well, then you have to somehow quietly demonstrate your power without throwing it or flaunting it in their face, because that will just incite more conflict. Again, it's the messaging strategy.
Here's an observation in the chat. And by the way, I think that was a really great example, Adam. Thank you for sharing that one. It's given me a lot to think about as you enter a situation, really focusing on what does this person want and making sure that all the other stuff around it doesn't overtake that.
Where's the expectancy?
But the expectancy part. So the observation in the chat is this, and this is by one of our female librarians. Sometimes as a woman, I may enter an interaction with an expectation that I won't be taken seriously by, for example, the select board. My expectation likely impacts that interaction from the very beginning.
Yep.
Having those relationships makes a big difference in my professional life. The more long-term relationship I have with our select board now allows me to enter those interactions confidently. So it was just an observation, and just so you know, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great observation. So, because it's probably absolutely accurate, you know, I'm never dismissive of somebody saying, well, yeah, but you're a guy, so you can get away with that. You know, that I got slapped in the face with that really big. One of my last positions, I asked an employee of mine to go down and speak with a couple of doctors about something. And she said, no way, I'm not doing that. I'm like, what? I'm like, fine. So I just went down and I took care of it. I came back up and I looked at her and said, I don't understand why this is a problem for you. And her response was, they react differently to you. I don't get the same response. And she put that off as gender. Now, in this specific case, this is a person who actually said to someone when she was disciplining them, I am your boss and you will respect my authority. I think there were some other issues in there other than gender. So while gender almost always plays a role in these things, you have to examine a lot of the underlying behavior and history you have with these folks before you just assign it and say, well, this is a gender issue. Because it's not always just a gender issue. Gender has influence in everything. There were times when it was difficult for me to bring things forward to one of my bosses who was a woman because she was dismissive of me because I was a guy. It happens both ways. But you know, the reality is it's what you bring into the room. People can, again, remember, blink, remember, your statements when you talk demonstrate who you think you are. So I have one trustee here. I'm not sure if Deb Hoadley's on the call, but I have one trustee here. I wonder if she'll recognize her. But, you know, right from the very get-go, it was obvious she was always ready for a knife fight. Everything. She was ready for a knife fight in the trustee meetings. She was ready for a knife fight with the select board. She was ready for a knife fight every time she talked about anything. And that sort of presentation, I could tell. She never said it, but it was her presentation and the way she laid out her expectations of how things were going to go. The stress level she brought into it. All of those things are there. Walking into these circumstances without giving anyone a clue of how you really feel about anything sets them back because they don't know. So they're left guessing with what it is you're actually looking for until you fill them in. And then they get a nice clear picture on what it is you're looking for. So, you know, I'm actually going to use one of Lori's cases. And if I mess it up, Lori, you can tell me. When Lori worked up at one library, I can't remember which library it was, she used to walk in and on a regular basis, her staff would say, you know, hey, how you doing? And Lori's response was, you know, I'm fine. And she would kind of roll her eyes and laugh and you know, go into her office. And, you know, when I look at that, I say, you know, where's the constitutive rule? Where's the regulative rule? Where's the power structure? There's no gender at play there because you've got, you know, two women talking, maybe longitudinally who's been there longer or not longer. But, you know, the reality is, so talking to Lori, she says, this is kind of a game we play, right? It's a game, you know, just like the dozens, right? They ask me the question, I say, fine, even though things clearly aren't necessarily fine. So what's happening there? How is that relationship building? Well, the staff are asking a question sincerely, but they're not getting a sincere answer. They're getting kind of a jokey answer. So if I was on the staff and I was thinking about that, again, laying in some expectancy here, I would say, I wonder if that means they don't ever really expect the director to confide in me or to tell me the truth about what they're really thinking. I wonder if they don't think they can trust us. There are all sorts of things that underlie that sort of game when it's not an explicit game like the dozens. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But, you know, unless you can answer that question, you can't answer. I think I said X and you think I said Y. What are all the implications of both of those things all the way through there? You know, you have to weigh and measure how those things go. Remember, I told you this is a ton of work in the beginning. It gets really, really easy. And I can tell you, I've been studying this stuff forever. I've been teaching it for a really long time. That doesn't mean I'm any good at it either. It just means that I generally understand when I've messed up. So I know when I violated the rules. I know when I've stepped too far or gone too long with this.
So here's another question from the chat, and you got my example right. And I put in the chat that whenever it became a joke with my staff, but it is something that I'm glad I know about now, and especially after talking with you about it, because it does set up a different kind of relationship and the expectancies that I did not realize was being set up. Because the more stressed I am, the more I say I'm fine. So anyways, but the question in the chat, so one of our librarians says, at the onset of my first interaction with our select board, I was asked, where are the brownies? I was thrown by that and ended up laughing with them, sort of. This happened 2 or 3 times until it finally ended. I never figured out if they thought because I'm a woman that I needed to bring snacks or what the issue was. I saw bringing brownies to a Board of Selectmen meeting as an attempt to bribe. How could I have handled this differently?
Okay, so I'm going to give you back another example. We have a select board member here who's a little bit notorious. He likes to hide all the women. He's very Italian, and it's very obvious. It doesn't take much perception to be able to pick up on that. I went to my first select board meeting. He introduced himself, and he followed up with very quickly with, I'm the troublemaker you've heard about. And my response to that was, I thought I was supposed to be the troublemaker. That's what I heard. And he ended up cracking up laughing and just sort of shook his head, and it all got put away. So I go to a select board meeting, they look at me and they say, where are the brownies? Hannaford? In your kitchen at home? I'm not sure. Am I supposed to bring brownies to the meeting? Why not? I mean, any response, don't let it lie. Find out if it's a joke. Find out, what do they mean by that? Do you have any availability of history? Can the staff tell you whether or not you actually brought brownies? I agree. In that scenario, I wouldn't be bringing brownies in. You're the damn library director. You're not their chef. You're not their pastry chef. Maybe it's a fun little gag that's gone on for a while, but that's not your job. And if you want to say that quite outright, just say, well, I spend enough time running the library and I have very little time to bake brownies at home. Sorry about that. Sorry if that's a shift from before, but that's sort of the reality. I don't do brownies. I can think of a lot of ways. I'd need to know more about the select board, their makeup, all men, women, men, how long they've been there, and a little bit more about their roles. Because like I said, every interaction is very, very specific. And just as a side note, before we actually run out of time, anyone who wants to call with questions about how might I, if you think I can add some value to that, I'm more than happy. I love this stuff. I talk to my wife, Leslie, over at Wigan Memorial all the time about this stuff. We bounce things off each other because I oftentimes need to talk to her about how an interaction is going. It almost always helps to have some outside perspective. I just happen to have some skill set in dissecting these things. So anyone who wants to reach out to me, please feel free. We're done with our budget session, so I got time right now.
So Adam, the person who put that question in said that they did not know that the prior director used to bring brownies to every Board of Select meeting they attended as the library director. She didn't know that at that first meeting, but found out about that later. So there's a little context.
Yeah, so not to say, oh my God. But before I went to the select board, I actually asked about every single select board member I could and got as much history as I could because I wanted to walk in prepared. So I knew exactly what was going to happen. When I walked in, I knew what would happen. And over the next 3 or 4 interactions with the select board, most expectancy has been validated. The one thing that I've only really just figured out is that when this particular select board member says something, he absolutely does not want a response. Doesn't want a response. And that is sometimes very valuable to know. So I know that when he comes up to me and he has some off the cuff, bizarre comment or statement, he's not looking for an answer. It's all rhetorical. He just wants to hear himself talk. And that's fine because actually we have a great relationship. Like I said, my job as a consultant was always to find things to like about people. And I don't see this as being any different than that. And it's important to develop the relationships. It is hard to have, incredibly difficult to have an honest, forthright, respectful relationship unless you can find something that you can like about the people you're interacting with.
That's a really great example of how we need to assess what people, again, a reminder, we need to assess what are people looking for, and you figured out that particular select board member didn't want a response. And that, I think that's an uncomfortable place for a lot of us to be, especially librarians. We tend to want to convince people to come over to our side, whatever that side is. So just sitting there and listening to somebody and not providing a response that either challenges that or only validates part of that is hard for people, but it's worth observing that and practicing it, which is, I think, what your point is.
Remember back to what we were talking about. You're giving him a response. Remember, silence counts. So you are giving him a response, and you're giving him the response he expects and wants, which is you're being an audience. That's what he wants. He wants an audience. By giving him that audience, nothing says that the audience has to agree with what the guy's saying. You're just listening to him.
5-minute warning.
Yep. Questions? More questions?
Nothing in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself. Again, just identify yourself when you speak.
I mean, there are other examples, so let's go into another quick example. So library director has been petitioning her select board to get her staff paid appropriately for years. Every year she gives them the exact same data, and because they request it. And every year she takes a very personal approach to making the plea of really, we have to get these staff members up to what's fair and what's appropriate. And it never works. They always sort of say, oh yeah, we hear, yeah, that's great. And then they don't approve those increases. And it's over 6, 7, 8, 9 years. You can imagine the gaps grow pretty radically. So they asked me if I'd be willing to talk to them, and the trustees and the director asked if I'm, so I go in and I talk to them and listen to what their messaging has been. And what their messaging has essentially been is, I need to show my staff that I value them. And in order to do that, I need to get them these raises because they really deserve it. And while that's an absolutely appropriate message, it falls flat for those selectmen because it does, for whatever reason. And as a result, the director always gets this sense of personal failure that she's failed her staff. So what I suggested is that this time they go in and they say that, here's all the same data. We've done this every year. And the community at this point has said that they're quite concerned because they hear that some staff may be leaving because the pay scales are not really appropriate in terms of like communities and stuff. And we really love our library. So the community is supportive of this. And we certainly agree with the community, but it's the community who's making this sort of demand. And that was it. No comment from, I think, the library believes. No, the community who supports the library says that these people deserve this. Nothing about being right or wrong or fair. All sorts of judgment terms are taken out of it. And if I remember correctly, and I may not, but if I remember correctly, after the meeting, the town manager came down and said, wow, that wasn't very fair. You laid that right at the select board's feet. Yep, because now the select board is going to be responsible for telling the community at large that, yeah, we hear you and we know that you value the library people, but yeah, we don't think they're worth it. They're not telling the library director. They can take it out on that person, but they can't take it out on the community as a whole. So with one quick little shift, we change the conversation's the same, but we change the context and the setting of it. And as a result, again, if I remember correctly, their pay scales were adjusted radically in that year. And then again, there was a plan set in place to bring them up to parity with the other places so they would be where they belong. So again, it's just a matter of shifting things and changing the conversation, changing the messaging strategy. It is possible, even after years of embedded messaging that hasn't been successful.
Any last thoughts, Adam? There's no questions in the chat, or is there anyone who wants to unmute and ask a question? We've got about 4 minutes.
Yeah, just to note, if this is anything like any of the times I talk with docs, sometimes there are circumstances you don't want to share in front of other people. Anyone who does talk to me, even though it's not a formal consulting relationship, it won't go anywhere. None of these case studies I've talked about were talked about without permission from the folks that I'd spoken with originally. So if you want to call and you have a specific question, or you're looking for some kind of resolution, or you want to work towards something, let me know. I'm happy to take it on. That stuff it's super fun for me. I really, really enjoy it. And I may not be the best, but I'm actually pretty good at it, amazingly.
Hey, Adam, this is Cabin Plasto.
Yeah.
Yeah, if for folks who wanted to do some self-study without getting a master's degree, are there any things you would recommend, or is it easier just to call you and have you do all the consulting work pro bono?
Yeah, probably easier, because the problem is that just like it's like taking a course in Excel, right? It does a gazillion things, but you only need to know how to sum a column.
Right.
So communication is this massive, broad study program. If you let me know, if you give me a call and say, this is kind of what I'm looking for, I could give you much more directed stuff to look at, or we can just chat about it. It doesn't matter. Because really, you can go down the rabbit hole very quickly. You don't ever want to let this go to the point of just a pure intellectual exercise. If it's just an intellectual exercise, it's useless, because you're not getting results. And that's what, we don't have time for that. That much I get. We need results. So if you just want to get to a result, give me a call, let me know, and I can either point you to resources, or I can give you whatever suggestions I can. And again,
Yeah,
I'm not always
folks who may not realize that there are different ways of doing things, whether it's a director and how they interact with their staff or with their trustees.
Yep.
Just something, like you said, the Malcolm Gladwell or Deborah Tannen or whatever, just things that may prompt them to actually ask the right questions that could then spark, oh, I do have a problem here. And okay, I'll go talk to Adam, or I'll talk to Lori, or whoever my trusted people are.
I think the way to think of it is that if you have any interaction in the course of your stuff that gives you this weird little sense that maybe things aren't quite going right, or alternatively, you have the sense of, I'm doing everything right. Why is everybody pushing back at me? There's probably an issue in there. Those are the people I find are the ones who mostly need help. The ones who swear they've never made a mistake in their life. They are absolutely right, and they're doing the right thing. And they don't understand why everybody keeps pushing back on them. Because it's not that you're wrong, it's that your messaging is wrong. You're missing the meaning. So, when you find a way to sort of navigate in through the meaning, then you're in great shape. So that's what you should look for. You should look for, are there circumstances in your library that people just don't seem to get it? And you think you've been perfectly clear, but they're just not getting it. Or you have trouble with your vendors, or you have trouble with the select board, or a trustee, or your trustees. Any one of those things that just don't seem to make sense to you, I'll guarantee you the root of it is in the messaging somewhere. Theirs to you, yours to them, whatever. And again, it's not about fault. It's just about lack of overlap in getting to that point of what's called conversational enmeshment. And that's where the meaning comes out, where everybody understands everybody, and you're clean, and you can move forward with everybody understanding and getting it.
Yeah, for me, I'm just convinced I have blind spots, and I'm always worried about, okay, what am I missing? And yeah, I'm sure there's
those things happen best in conversation.
Right.
That's all I can tell you. It's almost impossible to really self-analyze, because like you said, if it's a blind spot, it's a blind spot. But sometimes it comes out in conversations. And like I said, I'm happy to have those conversations. It's always, for me, it becomes a learning experience, because I learn more. I expand my worldview. It also expands the person I'm talking to's worldview, because as you'll find, I'll introduce 15 or 16 different scenarios, different ways to think about things. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? Well, what about this? And one of those things will actually hit, oh, okay, so there's where the meaning gap is. But those things happen best in interaction. And like I said, I'm more than happy to. I really, really enjoy this stuff. I love being a director. I love this role, but I can handle this work right now. And if other people in this call or around the state have questions or just aren't sure, just call. We'll suss it out together. It's nice. It's easy. And you don't have to take my word for it. It doesn't, I don't have to be gospel here. But if I can put you on a path towards divining intent or divining meaning, then that's good enough for me.
That's awesome, Adam. And I will put your contact information in with the link to the recording of this when I get that to a home that can handle the bigness of the file. But that will be, the recording will be going out to everybody. Thanks, everyone. We've run out of time. Appreciate, Adam, all of your insight and knowledge. I've learned quite a bit personally, and I have more that I want to learn. So thanks, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again soon. The next directors meeting is the first week in February on the 3rd of, I think it's the 4th of February. So we'll see you then. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.